Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. In this video I want to spend some time talking about John Locke's theory of personal identity, and then towards the end I'll spend some time talking about the philosopher Thomas Reid's criticisms of Locke's theory. So I'll go ahead and begin. I wrote a short essay on the topic and we'll be reading from it. Okay, in chapter 27 of an essay concerning human understanding, John Locke develops his theory of personal identity. He uses the famous example of the prince and the cobbler to help capture this theory. Before getting into a discussion of this example, we need to know a bit about Locke's methodology as he endeavors to account for what personal identity is. The key ideas here involve thinking about first what a person is, and second thinking about persistence. In what follows, I will explain Locke's methodology, then explain his theory of personal identity by focusing on his prince-cobbler example, and then lastly I'll discuss Thomas Reid's response to Locke from Reid's essays on the intellectual powers of man. To anticipate, Reid finds Locke's theory unconvincing and problematic in important ways. So Locke's methodology. The kinds of objects in which Locke is interested, generally speaking, are continuants, things that continue to exist across times, even through changes across these times. Locke argues that several kinds of things exist in this way: atoms, complex bodies, complex makeups, the things that are made up of atoms, I should say, biological organisms, and persons. Each of these kinds is a continuant, or something that continues to exist. Or to put it in other words, is a persisting thing, a thing that exists across times through changes. Plausibly enough, Locke believes that these kinds of objects have persistence conditions, meaning they have conditions that account for how they continue to exist across times. A person is a kind of thing that has consciousness, self-consciousness, including but not limited to memory and rationality. A person is the kind of thing that can act for reasons and be responsible, often in a moral sense, for its actions. Locke wants to know what it is that accounts for persistence conditions. By answering this question, he thinks he will know what it is that accounts for what we are. Okay, let's turn to Locke's prince-cobbler case. Locke has this imaginary case where a prince's soul, which contains the prince's consciousness, is transferred to the body of a cobbler, the soul which has been abandoned. In this case, Locke wants us to see that the person of the prince is now in the body of the cobbler. This is true, Locke argues, even though the cobbler's living human organism is still there. Locke wants us to see that the man, the human organism of the cobbler, is still there, even though the person that was the cobbler is not now part of or now existing in the man's body. Indeed, the people who knew the cobbler are likely to identify the cobbler with the prince's soul as the cobbler, with the prince's soul as the cobbler, because this is the ordinary way in which we tend to identify the people we know. We tend to identify the people we know in virtue of their bodies. But in this case, the cobbler, the person of the cobbler, is gone and has been replaced with the prince, the person of the prince. The prince-cobbler case, if right, shows us that the man, or the woman as the case may be, is not the same person when we understand man, or a man, as a living organism. There could be countless transfers possible into a single organism, like the one that takes place in the prince-cobbler case. So we can imagine that we take out the prince from the cobbler's body and replace it with another consciousness, and yet another one, and this could go on indefinitely. Okay, now this may not actually happen, but the point here is that it's possible that this happens, and that's all Locke wants to say. That's all he really needs for his argument to go through here. So likewise, Locke thinks it's implausible to suppose that the person is any kind of soul substance, if the soul carries the consciousness, which is the person. This is because the soul might be able to carry numerically different consciousnesses over the course of its existence. So if you have a soul substance, there's nothing, at least in principle, which makes it impossible that different consciousnesses exist within that soul substance. Okay, just like we could have different consciousnesses, presumably, possibly existing in a material substance, say a physical body like the cobbler's body. So that is, soul substances could possibly house many distinct consciousnesses, that is, many distinct persons. So, according to Locke, we now have this theory of what it means to be a person. Persons are consciousnesses. We continue to exist as persons, as consciousnesses. So we continue to exist as persons, as consciousnesses. So our persistence conditions involve having the same consciousnesses across time, through all our changes. So Locke is traditionally understood to hold a psychological theory of personal identity. according to which we persist in virtue of our psychology persisting. That is, take any person S existing at time t and any person P existing at time t star. S and P are the same person if and only if S and P share the same consciousness. Put more simply, to be the same person you were in the past is to have the same consciousness you had in the past. Okay, or to be the same person in the future is to have the same consciousness, okay, that you have now, okay, as you have in the future. But what does it mean for S and P to share the same consciousness? Locke analyzes sharing the same consciousness in terms of memory. So S at T and P at T star share the same consciousness if and only if P at T star is able to remember elements of S's consciousness at T. In other words, maybe put more simply, to be the same person you were in the past is to be able to remember things from your past. Okay, so that gives us Locke's rough view. We are consciousnesses. That is what that means to be a person. To be a person is to have a consciousness. Even though the person undergoes lots of change, the person still, over time, continues to exist as, or in virtue of being, the same consciousness. And consciousness and having the same consciousness is analyzed, as we see, in terms of memory. Okay, so sometimes it's said that what Locke has is a memory theory of personal identity. Okay, so let's look at some of Reid's challenges. Before we get directly to Reid's challenges, though, we could look at the fact that Locke anticipates many of Reid's challenges in his work, The Essay. So Reid's challenges, but before we get directly to Reid's challenges, again, let's look at what Locke anticipated in Reid's challenges. So Locke anticipates some of Reid's challenges in chapter 27 of The Essay, as has been stated. Locke is willing to accept the counterintuitive consequences sleep, forgetfulness, amnesia, and drunkenness have for his theory. All of these admit of cases in which consciousness seems to be affected in such a way as to imply, according to Locke's theory, that we would have distinct consciousnesses where it seems we only have one. To make this clear, think about the problem of drunkenness. It appears that if Jones gets really drunk tonight and then wakes up not remembering last night, it would follow, according to Locke's theory, that Jones is not the same person as the one who got drunk. Now suppose the drunk person last night really hurt someone with a malicious intent while being drunk. Who's responsible for this? By Locke's theory, Jones isn't, but it seems Jones is responsible for this. Moreover, it seems that Jones existed while he was drunk. So this seems to be a big problem, especially because Locke says that personhood, or being a person, is a term that's closely connected to responsibility and whether it be legal or moral. It looks like this theory gets the wrong result here, because it seems as if Jones is someone who's going to be legally and or morally responsible for his behavior while he is drunk. Okay? Setting that aside, it seems as if Jones was the person who was drunk, but Locke's theory doesn't predict that. The same general problem here would be true in other cases of forgetfulness, or in the more serious case of amnesia, as well as in the problem of dreamless sleep. In all these cases, it looks like Jones would end up distinct from the person who forgets, develops amnesia, or enters into a dreamless sleep. Again, these seem like the wrong result. Now, as I said, Locke anticipates these objections, and what he wants to say is these aren't the wrong result. Intuitively, they seem like the wrong result, but we need to revise our theory of thinking about personal identity. In these cases, we have distinct persons. So Jones goes out of existence for the time in which he's drunk, of course, okay? Or the time in which he's dreamlessly sleeping, the time in which he develops amnesia, or otherwise forgets something, okay? Okay, so he has to live with those consequences. Okay, Reid, he picks up on these objections. He develops a famous example, of a brave officer who had been corporally punished for stealing from an orchard as a boy. Now later in his life, the officer completely forgets the corporal punishment that happened to him when he was a boy. This seems to wrongly imply that the boy and the officer are, strictly speaking, not the same person, at least according to Locke's theory. So Locke's theory would imply that the boy is not the same person as the brave officer, and vice versa. Okay. Now, of course, this is a problem that Locke anticipated and seemed willing to accept, but once again, this seems to be the wrong result, and just because Locke accepts it and is willing to say bite the bullet doesn't mean that Locke's acceptance and willingness to bite the bullet is justified. Okay, Reid identified two other problems among others, but I'll just focus on two of them. The first is that Locke seems to have confused the evidence we have for personal identity with our personal identity itself. That is, memory is the way in which we know we are the same person we were at some past time. For example, Smith, currently the lawyer, knows she is the same person that was a law student 10 years ago because she remembers being a law student. Reid wants to say that we should confuse Smith's evidence for being the same person as she was in the past with what it is that makes her the same person. So it seems like Locke has confused these two things. The second problem that Reid identified, that I'm going to discuss here, is that by identifying our personal identity with consciousness, he did so with something that is constantly changing. Our consciousness is like a stream of thoughts, rarely ever exactly in the same state. Locke's identification of our personal identity with consciousness strikes Reid as odd because Reid thinks it's counterintuitive to think that the thing that accounts for the sameness of persons across times through changes, okay, is rarely ever the same, with something that's rarely ever the same. That is, take a state of consciousness C at time t. C is almost always at least a little distinct from other states of consciousness at other times. So for any state of consciousness, C to the n, at any time t to the n, C1 at T1 is almost always distinct from C2 at T2. So Reid, he argues that since consciousness is almost always changing, it is dubious whether it can account for the sameness of persons. And if this is right, then it is dubious whether sameness of consciousness can account for responsibility. The idea here being that states of consciousness themselves lack identity across time. So it seems implausible to state that they can provide the basis for the sameness of personal identity, and consequently, as we've seen, for responsibility. So this seems to be a big problem. We'd like to have something that is changeless account for what it is that persists. And it seems like consciousness isn't a good candidate for a thing that is changeless because of the fact that it's constantly changing. So what Reid wants to say is that this is an odd result. This is an odd part of Locke's theory. So in conclusion, Locke's theory of personal identity has some initial intuitive plausibility, especially when we think about the Prince-Cobbler case. It seems like the prince goes where his consciousness goes. But when put to the test by Reid's incisive critique, and even by some of the critiques that Locke anticipated in his work, it looks like the theory needs more work. It doesn't seem to be enough for Locke to accept that people can become altogether different in number merely because they forget something that happened to them when they were younger, or get drunk, or fall asleep, or develop amnesia, etc. It would be interesting to see whether this theory had the resources to deal with the problems he had tried to develop, had he tried to develop it more. Okay, but it looks like, on the face of it, at least as Locke articulated, the theory needs a lot more work, and that Reid's objections were rather incisive. Okay, that concludes my discussion of John Locke on personal identity and Reid's critique of the theory. Thank you for watching, everybody. If you have any questions or comments about what I've said today in this video lecture, please don't hesitate to contact me at jedickin@syr.edu or at jadickin@calpoly.edu. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.